It is the Martha Zoller Show, and as I try to do from time to time is bring in people that we can talk to in an in-depth way about the issues of the day. And joining me right now, and I've been calling her Senator Michelle Au because she used to be a senator, but it's Representative Michelle Au. She represents the Johns Creek area, so she's in our listening area. And we wanted to talk to her today because she's a Democrat, I'm a Republican, but I think we can find some common ground on a number of issues. Michelle, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So tell us first about you, because you're from Johns Creek. You're kind of a hop, skip, and a jump from here. Tell us a little bit about you first.
Yeah, so I do represent Johns Creek. House District 50 is the number of my House District. And I'm actually a practicing physician in Metro Atlanta, something I know you appreciate because your husband is a primary care physician. And I ran for office for the first time in 2020. And the reason I ran at that time was that I recognized a problem that I think a lot of doctors see pretty fairly early on in their training, which is that a lot of the problems that make our patients sick and make our communities less healthy than they could be are upstream issues that are outside of our ability to address at the bedside. Especially for me, because I'm a practicing anesthesiologist, by the time my patients get to me, which is usually right before we're going to the OR, it is really too late to address a lot of the issues that made them sick in the first place, right? So while we can give them medications and get them through surgery, obviously, and treat their pain and all these important things that we do, a lot of the things that we could have done preventative are at the level of sort of social determinants of health, which is what we call them in the public health sphere. So these have to do with things like access to health care, broader things like public safety, access to quality education, all these things that make a community more healthy. So when I ran for office, it was really in an effort to extend my Hippocratic Oath and try to help patients both before and after they got to the hospital.
So, and what's interesting too, because my husband often says he's an internist. He says I don't solve any problems because nobody listens to me, meaning that if my patients stopped drinking, smoking, and started eating right, I would have nothing to do. Okay, so it's you're managing things, you know. You're not like an emergency room doctor where you patch people on and move them on. You're managing things over the long term. And I think that's always a challenge. So did you find when you got in, because you were elected in 2020 as a senator, you are a Democrat in an area, it was kind of you flipped the district, right?
The district was flipped by Zara Karenchak, who came immediately before me.
Got it. So it was fairly new. It's an area that has a lot of red around it, correct, right?
Correct. I think essentially all the House districts around me are held by Republicans.
Right. So what was it like, and did you find that you were able to start getting some of those things done?
Yeah, you know, the very interesting and I think gratifying thing about representing a true swing district is that it relies on a lot of the skills that one has as a clinician, right? Which is that a lot of the skill, the soft skill of being a doctor, as you know, has to do with listening to patients, right? Not telling them what they care about, but listening to what they want you to work on, what their goals are, and providing them with the information they need to make the right decisions for them and for their families, right? So when you are in a swing district, you have to recognize that while the majority of people who voted did vote for you, also a lot of people who are in your district voted for someone else, right? So you represent everyone, right? So in that job, you really do have to be a good listener and find that middle ground that is the most effective to get the job done for everyone that you represent.
So I want to ask you one more question about personal stuff, and then we'll get on to the issues. So, and I hope it's not too personal, but obviously the makeup of physicians has changed quite a bit. There's more than 50% of the physicians now are women. And while I think that's great, on average, women don't practice as long full-time as their male counterparts. We haven't really increased the number of spots in medical school to reflect that, because I don't think there should be any restrictions on women practicing medicine, but it's a different animal than a man practicing medicine in a lot of cases. Did you have challenges in that area? Because I know you're a family person. You've got kids in college. You've got all in high school. How was that? Because you came along, maybe 20 years ago, 15, 18, 20 years ago? How has it changed?
Yeah, I graduated from medical school in 2003.
Okay, so 20 years?
About 20 years, right? And I think you're right. And this is something that we grapple with in medicine a lot, because medicine, like a lot of sort of established fields, is at times a little bit slower to change culturally than some other practices, right? And what we see in medicine and what we are dealing with is that obviously when you start medical school, you are in your 20s. I was 21 when I started medical school. And you are in training, both medical school and residency and fellowship, for a decade or more, right? And this is really the peak of people's youth when they're establishing their lives, when they're getting married, when they're choosing to have children, right? So balancing that professional aspect of what is, I think we can all understand, a very demanding and life-altering job with the biological concerns that people have of wanting to, start families and make their own adult lives, right? So when we talk about women in medicine, I think we do have to modernize our approach a little bit in how we approach training, right? And how we approach being a little bit less extremist in how we mandate that medicine is taught and how trainees are brought through the process, right? What we see in some residency programs now is that there are somewhat more allowances for residents being able to take a little bit more time off for maternity leave, right? When I had my first kid, it was my first year of anesthesia residency, which at the time was quite unorthodox. And I had to pay back all the time I took off, which was 5 weeks of maternity leave, so that I could graduate on time with my class, right? And I think that's fair, right? It's a very important job. I would not want to cut short my training, but just to make more allowances for people to be able to do these types of things so that we are not cutting into people's, fertility years or the time that they need to spend building their lives and family in sacrifice.
So my primary doctor is a female doctor who has children, and she, though, took over her father's practice. And so she had some flexibility in there when she had kids, and her kids are in high school now, and she does a great job. I mean, I love it. She still uses paper charts. She still really gets into the numbers. I love that she's an old school kind of doctor that knows me, and it's great. But my husband's funny because I mentioned in the last segment that he's the jail doc, and he does have a rotation of residents that come through from the hospital to see the medicine, and he finds it surprising that a lot of these primary care residents have never drawn blood, have never done certain things that were just standard when he was going through training. And so, like, sometimes he'll say to him, "You've never drawn blood? Well, we're drawing blood today. We're going to learn how to do this because you might find yourself in a situation where you need to do that." Yes, we're very specialized, right? But there might come a time where you need to know how to do something from that old training.
That's absolutely right. And I think that every medical trainee has had this experience because when I was, not to be that person, but when I was in training, I remember some of my attendings telling me, and they trained in sort of like the golden age of medicine, that they say, when you guys are so spoiled because now you draw blood and you send it to the lab and they spit out the results on the computer and you can see what the white blood cell count was. But back in our day, when we drew blood, we would put it under a slide and we would be manually counting the blood cells ourselves, right? So, I think that there is a value in that, and I love hearing those stories about how medicine used to be practiced because obviously the field of medicine has changed quite a lot with technology. But we do have to balance that importance of being able to take care of patients in all different situations and being equipped to have the skills we need to do that care, with recognizing that sometimes some technological advances and how hospitals are staffed does improve our throughput, and maybe especially with a healthcare worker shortage and having a physician shortage in this country and in this state, that sometimes it is the best use of a trained physician's time to be able to examine and take care of patients rather than drawing blood.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into some issues. What brought us together initially was school safety topics after the shooting at Appalachia High School. And, of course, that shooting is again in the news today because of the plea of the father of the shooter. So we'll talk about that next with Representative Michelle Au. It is the Martha Zoller Show. We're here with Representative Michelle Au. And we love talking about the issues of the day. And what brought us together was kind of talking about what happened at Appalachia High School. And, of course, we know today that Colin Gray, who's the father of the Appalachia High School shooter, Colt Gray, just entered a not guilty plea this morning to charges, including 2 counts of second-degree murder. I think this is the first time in Georgia that that's happened, that one of the parents are actually charged also. But this is an issue that has many components. I'm on the State Board of Education. I represent the 9th District, and this is something we talk about all the time. In fact, down in Polk County has actually started their own police department for the school system. It's got a deputy and it's got sheriffs, and that way they know these folks are never going to be pulled away, that they're going to be in the school system, and they came up with the $3 million to do it, and they're being very innovative about it. And that's one of the things I kind of love about what we're doing in this space, is that school systems are looking at what works best for them, and they're trying to put things together. So give us your thoughts in general about, kind of where we need to go on school safety, and also what the components are in your mind.
Yeah, I think you're
That's
right.
That's a big question.
I know it is a big question.
I know.
But I think you're right that there are many different solutions at play here, and on an issue that's this broad and this complex, we really have to be open to the fact that any solution is going to be multifaceted and multifactorial, right? So obviously when we're talking about the immediate sense of school safety, having security officers at schools, having a more nimble police force that is set to respond to emergencies at schools is good, right? Like my kids go to public schools. Also, I think about it, all the time. Essentially, every week when I'm dropping my kids off at school, because it's such a pervasive problem that we have to worry about, are my kids going to be safe at school? Which is obviously a shame, but it's what we're dealing with now. But in addition to directly responding to emergencies and horrific incidents of violence like school shootings, we also have to be willing to entertain solutions that are further upstream, like preventing gun violence in the first place, right? And especially when we're talking about Appalachia and we're talking about the shooter in that case who was a 14-year-old student, right? It's natural to ask, how could a 14-year-old get access to this weapon in the first place? And the second thing it's reasonable to ask is, what can we do to prevent this from happening in the future?
Well, and I think Superintendent Schofield, who's Hall County Schools, he has put a program together that he's not only taught here in Hall County, but he's taking it around the state and around the country, quite frankly, because he makes the point, and this is true. He says, we know who our school shooters are. They, in every case, it's not some random person that walked into the school. It's somebody that has access to the school. Either they're a student, they're an employee, they're the family member of a student or employee, but it's somebody in that world, that sphere, okay? And that what they're doing in Hall County schools, and have had great success in reducing the number of violent incidences in Hall County schools, is teaching how to interact with people, teaching how to de-escalate, teaching to not only everywhere from the janitor to the teacher to the student to the parents, these skills that you might need. And I think he's making some progress. And because he did not want to default to making the schools fortresses, because he thinks that's bad for kids too, okay, because it makes them feel like they're unsafe all the time. So I thought that was an interesting point. I think there's a place for that in this solution.
Yeah, I absolutely think there's a case for that. And I think you're right that oftentimes when we're talking about school shootings, which is the type of gun violence that tends to get the most attention, I think it's fair to say, even though they make up by far the smallest number of incidents of gun violence. But we all care about our kids. We all want our kids to be safe, especially when they're away from us, especially when they're in what is supposed to be a safe place. And I think this type of training about how to deal with people and de-escalation is an important part of it, right? I don't think we should discount that at all, right? But it has to be part of a multifactored solution when we deal with this. When we are talking about the fact that most school shooters are, as you noted, either current or former students, right? That really brings into the light the fact that a lot of these shooters are quite young, right? So what are some methods that we can adopt that can be both legislative or non-legislative, right, to prevent these young people from getting access to a gun for impulsive crimes like this?
We've done some very good work in Georgia with expanding services for foster care kids beyond 18, because you may not know this, but in the Parkland shooting in Florida, this young man had aged out of the foster care system. His foster mother had died of cancer, and he, like a lot of foster kids, had been in a lot of foster homes, but had really bonded with this final foster family, and his foster mother died of cancer. He called in to DFACS, or whatever Florida's version of that is, and said he was having trouble with this death, and basically was told, well, you've aged out, there's nothing we can do for you. And then a couple of days later, the Parkland shooting happens. And so I believe in that case that the system let this young man down. Not that he is not responsible for what he did. He is responsible for what he did. But he tried to get help, and he didn't have any help. And so as a result of that, not only Florida, but in Georgia, we have passed some additional services for kids that are 18 to 24 that are coming out of the foster care system. And so I think that's a positive thing. I agree with you that parents and wherever these young people are getting these guns, we need to know about that. Because, look, I went to Columbia High School in DeKalb County, okay? Half of the boys I knew had guns in their car, okay? They were going hunting afterwards because, if you can believe it, DeKalb County was not as built up as it was when I went to high school, And so it wasn't – all the boys I knew carried knives in their pockets. I mean, it was not ever – and we didn't have this kind of interaction, really. And if we did – they might get into a little fight. It wasn't a knife fight. They get into a fight, and they'd end up being better friends afterwards. I don't understand that whole dynamic because I'm not a boy. But things have changed in the way, and a lot of it has to do with the family structure. A lot of it has to do with other things. I think these phones that we have in our hands has a lot to do with it. I think that young people, instead of being told, all of us, instead of being told that maybe our ideas are crazy, that we're in this isolated world where people only agree with us, and that sometimes crazy ideas flourish in those kind of worlds. So there's a lot of aspects to this.
Yeah, and I think what you are pointing to is something that Democrats and Republicans actually agree on quite a lot, which is that there is a mental health crisis taking place in this country and in this state, and that mental health services need to be better resourced and more attention needs to be paid to them, right? I think we see that especially in the wake of COVID, that with youth mental health, that has been really underaddressed. And that's something that I know the Georgia General Assembly has been focused on, especially under the leadership of late Speaker Ralston, that was his his flagship bill during his last session was improving our mental health access system, right? So that definitely needs to be part of the discussion. I would also note that when we talk about gun violence, that the top type of gun violence that we see in this country actually is not mass shootings or homicides, it's actually suicide, right? So that is an important piece when we talk about gun violence that I think we can agree on, that mental health is a huge part of what we need to address. And in addition to that, right, when we talk about prevention and when we talk about access to guns, especially for young folks and teenagers, right, if we know that more and more young folks are having these types of mental health crises that lead to violent incidents, we need to make sure that we are not as readily arming this type of mental health crisis so that it comes to a point where people are being shot rather than just having a fight in the hallway, as you noted.
And roughly just the numbers, since Michelle alluded to them, about 49,000 gun violence deaths happen in America every year. About half of those are suicide. And then, a lot of the rest of them are people that know each other. I'm not going to call them all love triangles, but they're people that know each other. This idea of someone you've never heard of or never seen is not really what happens. And that the school violence stuff is a very small number, but again, gets a lot of attention. So we've got lots more to talk about. We'd love to know what you think. 770-535-2911. Lots more to come right here on the Martha Zoller Show. It is the Martha Zoller Show. We're here with Representative Michelle Au, who is in the Georgia legislature. She represents Johns Creek. She's a Democrat. She's in a swing district, so she's always got opposition. And so just quickly, how was your election this time? Because it was an interesting time, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was an interesting time. This is my second time running in a presidential year, so obviously that amps up the atmosphere quite a bit. But it does make it a lot more exciting, and especially being in a swing district within a swing state, you recognize how important it is to do the work you're doing, and that everything you're doing to turn out voters is amplified, not just for the state, but for the country.
Now, how did your district go? Now, you won, but did it go for Trump or did it go for Harris? Do you know?
My district, and we're still waiting for the full numbers, but my district did go for Harris. I think It's been trending more Democratic in the past decade or so, right? But it is a swing district, so it's always used as sort of a bellwether, that whole area of how the state is evolving.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, I was very surprised at the level of the win for President Trump. I thought that he would probably win, but I was surprised at the numbers, and that across the board, he actually had the most diverse coalition of voters that we've seen from a Republican in 50 or 60 years. And in the Asian community, it was interesting because people want to lump Asians together, just like they want to lump Hispanics together and all that kind of stuff. I have a line I use in a speech that why is it white men are the only people that are allowed to have a different point of view? They try to lump women together. They try to lump all this stuff. And in the Asian community, it was interesting because certain Asian communities went heavily towards Trump. And like Chinese and Japanese, and then other Asian communities were 3 or 4 more points towards Trump, but they all trended more towards Trump, which I thought was interesting.
Thank you so much for noting that disaggregation of the Asian community. That's something that, as Asian American leaders, we are constantly pushing for because using that broad term, AAPI, or Asian American Pacific Islander, groups together a lot of different people into one group, whereas there's a lot of variation, obviously, within those groups. But yes, I think what you're pointing to is something that we've seen nationally, is that there was a big swing towards the right in this election. And it wasn't uniform, and obviously some areas did continue to trend left, but that's something that we're going to have to continue talking about, why that happened. And as Democrats, as a party, we have to talk about what we're going to do moving forward to show voters that their goals are, in my opinion, often better served by Democratic ideals.
Well, I'm sure you saw this because in a state house race, you get out a lot, you talk to a lot of people, and you talk to what I like to call the shorts and T-shirt people in Georgia. I was talking with my friend Theron Johnson, who I've known for 20 years, and he was focusing very much, and I'm not going to drag you into the Democratic leadership battle. I'm not doing that, but I'm just telling this story, okay? I'm just telling this story because, Theron said something about the top members of the Democratic Party need to get together in a room and talk about what they need to do. And I said to him, and it's public record, I said it on the Georgia Gang, with all due respect, I think what y'all need to do is get out to talk to some people out on the street first, maybe go to a barbershop, maybe go wherever, and then come back and talk to what he called the elites in the party and talk about what you need to do. Because where I think they missed is talking to regular folks. And whether you like Donald Trump or not, the going to McDonald's and the dressing up in the garbage truck and the going to a construction site and going to a bodega and going to these kind of non-traditional places for candidates to go to actually helped him a lot because they felt like he understood them.
I think you are absolutely right in that assessment. And in my race in particular, because it is more of a local race, we did make a huge effort to do exactly that, which is not just having, meet and greets. And we did a listening tour pretty extensively through the district leading up to the election, but also going to people's houses and knocking on their doors, right? I actually had one constituent who was concerned about the election. He said, how can I best help? I have a lot of undecided voters that I know, and I really want to help them make this decision. I said, how you can help best? Invite them to your house if they're truly undecided, and I will come talk to them. And that's exactly what we did, right? I think oftentimes in politics, we tend to silo ourselves off and are talking to ourselves and people who already agree with us, which is, I think, not constructive towards the goal of changing people's minds and persuading them and asserting the majority, if that's one's goal, which I think generally it is in politics, right? But in a swing district, that is unavoidable, and that is a hugely important part of our job, is talking to people who don't already agree with us.
So what were the issues you heard as you were going through the neighborhoods?
So I live in Johns Creek. And, every district is a little bit different, but generally speaking, when I was on the doors and talking to voters, the top issue I heard about was the economy, right? I heard people talking about the cost of living. The cost of groceries came up often, right? And I think this has been borne out in polling and the postmortems that we've done after the election, that the economy was the number one issue. The second issue that was brought up to me in my district was this issue of public safety, right? My district is quite diverse. It actually has quite a large immigrant community, naturalized immigrants, right? And gun safety in particular came up a lot. And I don't know if that's just because of the work I've done in the General Assembly and people being aware of that and bringing that up because I was coming to them, right? But especially people who have families or who grew up maybe in a different country or in a different culture find the pervasiveness of guns in our society and how much they worry about their kids when they go to school, like we were talking about earlier, really a topmost concern, right? And regardless of if they tend to vote Republican or Democrat, this was a question that I consistently got asked.
Yeah, and I is Johns Creek in North Fulton? Or
Yes,
is
it's
it?
North
Okay.
Fulton.
So I always, look, I wasn't a big Fonnie Willis fan, and not for the reason you might think. It is because she has 14,000 felony criminals that have not been, have not been brought to trial yet. She also has, there's a number of, I think it's 4,000 rape kits or something like that, which I know is not totally her issue, but it seems like she cared more about a big name case. And I know you can walk and chew gum at the same time, but this is the way I think it felt to voters and the way it looked to me. Okay. She cared more about this big name case than she did about the kind of crimes. My daughter lives in Fulton County. Okay. I worry about it. And she's so funny that every time I go to visit her, she's like, Mom, you got to take everything out of your car. You got to do this. You got to do that. And so she's aware of it. So I think that she won her re-election, so God bless her. But I think that she's got to focus more on the actual crimes that are being committed against Fulton County residents and less on big name crimes. That's just my opinion.
I think that's fair, and I think that when I talk to voters in my district, oftentimes they will bring up a fear about rising violent crime nearby, even though Johns Creek is actually quite safe. But, you hear about it in the news, you worry about your families, you worry about your neighborhoods. And I think that's fair, right? So I think that what we need to do as politicians is not just note the problems and point to them, right? But to try to come up with solutions that serve the goals of what your voters want, right? So when we talk about violent crime, I think it's inevitable that we need to talk about the role of guns in that violent crime, which is what people bring up quite often, right? And say, like, look, if we're worried about gun violence in this community and worried about criminals getting access to guns, safe storage, for example, is a great concrete way to address that, because we know the top sort of source of guns used in the commission of crimes are actually stolen from vehicles, as you note, right? So this is a real, concrete, obvious, easy to explain solution to address a concern that voters have.
So how do you work with Speaker John Burns? How do you work with the governor? How do you work even with the Senate? How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that it's easy to be in the minority party, right? This is, I always refer to it as a math problem, because it is, right? Is that in order to pass any piece of legislation, you do need a majority of the votes, 50% plus one, which in the case of the House is 91 votes, right? And when you're a member of the minority party, you do not have enough votes purely within your own caucus to pass anything.
And what's
right?
that number now? Do we know what it is?
Yeah, it's 80 Democrats to 100 Republicans. So, we're closing that gap, but it is still significant, right? So the good thing about that is that for people who are accustomed to working across the aisle and people who are accustomed to consensus building, you recognize that this task of needing to bring people from the majority party along with your solution is maybe the most important thing you can do, right? And I think that shapes my approach to what types of bills I bring, and it shapes my approach to how I try to work on passing those bills. So I will give you one example. Is that there is a slate of gun safety bills that I'm working on. And one of them was a bill that has to do with offering a tax credit for purchase of safe storage equipment, right? This was modeled after a piece of legislation that passed in Virginia and was signed into law by Glenn Youngkin, who, as you know, is a Republican governor. When I drafted this piece of legislation, I had actually shopped it around for quite a long time, all through the summer before last session, to try to get a Republican top sponsor on it, because I recognize, as a Democrat, that the best way for this bill to pass is for Republicans to get behind it, and that it's more important for me to pass the bill than to have my name at the top or to get credit for it, right? That's how we get work done, is to not have an ego about it, right? I did end up pre-filing this bill, which means putting it in before the session started, and that bill actually ended up getting endorsed by a group called Georgia 2A, which is a quite prominent gun rights group that is favored by, I think, a lot of our Republican colleagues in the state legislature. And after that point, it became much easier to get Republicans on board, because they had the support and the cover of a very prominent pro-gun rights group to do something that I think a lot of Republicans, especially in more moderate districts like where I live, kind of want to do anyway, right? Because we recognize that maybe being too extreme about gun rights is putting us on the wrong side of the issue. And especially when our kids and our families are in danger, that we need to evolve in our thinking and find solutions that we can come to. So that bill evolved, and it ended up being, in another iteration, having 6 Republican top sponsors, right? But it's having that willingness to work across the aisle, and for Republicans to give them a lot of credit for being willing to evolve in their positions on this too. Because I think there was a time in the Georgia General Assembly where this bill would have been DOA and no one would have touched it, right?
Well, and you saw that in progress on hate crimes, progress on anti-Semitism, that kind of stuff. So, I think that you got to talk and you got to work and you got to do less of the grandstanding in the well, with all due respect. I'm not saying you do that. I'm just saying that there's too much of that that's looking for the clip that's going to be on the nighttime news than actually getting in the bunkers and working with people. Anyway, we're going to take a break. We've got one more segment with Representative Michelle Au. We'll be back. It is the Martha Zoller Show. We're here with Michelle Au, who is a representative from Johns Creek and a Democrat, and we'd like to always get together and talk about issues. And, okay, so I want to talk a little bit about abortion, okay, just a little bit about it. And mainly, obviously, I'm pro-life, and but I understand that I'm fully accepting of Roe v. Wade being overturned and going back to the states because people say, well, they voted you down in Ohio or wherever. That's fine. I think it should be back in the states. And, that's where it needs to be looked at. And Dobbs was a first trimester kind of thing. And I think that if you compare us to the rest of the world, you look at the UK, you look at France, you look at Germany, first trimester, I think is something most people could agree on. And I think if the baby's showing and the baby's kicking, if you're showing and the baby's kicking, it's probably too late unless there's a serious problem, right? So, but I am a totally pro-life person, but I live in the real world. Okay, that's how I like to describe myself. My big issue is over the abortion pill cocktail because that's where most abortions are being done now. And I think that there needs to be some oversight on that because of the complication rate. You are inducing a miscarriage, okay? It's not the same as the morning after pill, and a lot of people get them confused, And I think that it's not unrealistic to say if you are prescribed this medication, you probably need to get a checkup a day or two later to be sure everything's okay. And I have a hard time getting in front of Democratic women to make that case because I think it's a women's health care issue more than it is whether you're pro-life or pro-choice.
Yeah, I think you're right that this is a women's health care issue, right? And I think that you're also right that under ideal circumstances, that women should have the way to, after taking mifepristone and misoprostol, to be checked afterwards. I think that is sort of pretty typical that you will come back in for an ultrasound to make sure that the contents of your uterus have been evacuated from the procedure, right? I think that in a state like Georgia, which has a lot of issues with healthcare access in general, that we often have to balance that availability of idealized healthcare with the availability of getting patients the care they need. And when we talk about abortion care, something that I often try to introduce to people is that we have to look at the contrapositive also, right? And so there was a study that came out, not to get too medical about it, but in 2012, from a journal of obstetrics and gynecology that showed that the risk of pregnancy and labor and delivery is actually something on the order of 13 or 14 times higher than legal abortion, right? So we have to balance those things also, right? Obviously, when we look after abortion and we see cases like Amber Thurman, which I think a lot of us in Georgia are thinking about, and the complication that happened after taking mifepristone in that case, to balance that with the fact that in passing a law like HB 481, which created a legal environment that changes people's behavior around taking care of a patient post-miscarriage or post-taking the abortion pill, that it delays and denies care for patients that can lead to negative outcomes, not just purely taking the medication itself.
But I think what bothers me about especially the Amber Thurman case is that there was no heartbeat at the time she presented into the emergency room. So the heartbeat bill wouldn't have come into play at that thing. And so hospitals have had plenty of time to figure this out. And I agree with Ben Krupp, who is her attorney, that the hospital is at fault here, not the law, not HB 487. So, and look, I worked for Governor Kemp at the time, and I did not agree with the 6-week number. Okay. But I worked for him. So I had to advocate. When you work for an elected official, you have to advocate for their positions, okay? And so I think that it should be a longer time, but that's what the law is at this point in time. And so, I just feel that she was used in this election, in a way that she shouldn't have been. And it didn't, I don't think it helped that much with the outcome, quite frankly, of the election. And it caused her family a lot of pain, I think. So I don't agree with whatever any means necessary in politics. That's probably why I didn't get elected in my congressional race in 2012. Okay. So I think that you got to have some values that come in play there. And I think a lot of pain was caused to her family to no avail, really, by the way she was used in this election.
You know, I hear folks say that a lot about the Amber Thurman case in particular, is that providing what would have been the standard of care, which was evacuating her uterus, in seeing that there were still contents retained, causing bleeding and ultimately leading to sepsis, was what people would say is malpractice, or that the hospital and the practitioners weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And that's going to be a case that's adjudicated in the courts, I assume, ultimately, in determining what was right and what was wrong in that case. But I think what we have to look at in the context of having a state with a 6-week abortion ban is how having that law changed the behavior of those practitioners and that hospital in approaching what is really a pretty straightforward case, right? I think that even in the documented medical notes that were shared in writing about that case, that people knew that ultimately they would need to take the patient to the OR and evacuate the uterus, but they hesitated, right? Because there is confusion and fear around that ban, which was relatively new, and not wanting to run afoul of breaking the law and incurring those fines or going to jail, that they pushed that care, delayed that care to a point that it was irrevocable what happened to the patient.
And that's why I think it was malpractice, because you should do, when someone presents in the emergency room, whatever you need to do to save that person and not worry so much about the complications. That's what the problem, and this is a discussion for the next time we get together because we're running out of time here, but that's what the corporatization of hospitals has done. But we could get into that in a whole nother discussion anyway. Thank you so much for being so open and willing to talk about the different issues of the day. We've got about a minute and a half left. So I want is there any final thing, like would you like to let people know how they can get help from you or any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to have been reelected. I have a lot of work that's in progress that I think we've made a lot of good, headway on in my first 2 terms in the Georgia General Assembly. And I look forward to working with not just the members of my caucus, which has great new leadership that I'm looking forward to working under, but also with Republicans on getting this bill passed, because I do need their help to pass a lot of the things that we all care about.
Yeah, and I think that it's going to be really interesting to see. Now, if someone's listening from Johns Creek, because that is in our listening area, how can they get in touch with you?
The best way to reach out to me is either to call or email my office, right? We have staff who are monitoring all those lines, and constituent services is our top concern, right? Especially now that we're through the election and we're just fully concentrating on serving the district. Thank God, because that's the main thrust of my work. That's what I want to be doing, is please reach out to us for anything. And certainly we also have a very robust student services network where we have a fellowship where we will let students come in and work with our office and show them the way to become involved themselves.
Representative Michelle Au, thank you for being with me today. We're going to have a great time the rest of the week. I'll be doing the Georgia Gang tomorrow, so I'll be remote. But until then, we're always here, always local.